Millennia ago, I created a video about cancelled fighting games, and since much time has passed since then, I thought it would be interesting if we re-explored this topic. Just like any other video game genre, fighting games are very tricky to create, as not only do you have to reinvent the wheel through innovative gameplay mechanics and new characters that appeals to newer audiences, but you have to do it in such a way that pleases the older, more hardcore fighting game crowd, and trying to preach to both sides of the choir is much easier said than done. Because of this, it's no surprise that many fighting games have straight up been cancelled during their time of development, never to see the light of day, as they're doomed to an eternity of rot in a basement found in God knows where. Dramatics aside, I found 4 fascinating examples of fighting game cancellation over the years thanks to Unseen64 and video game historian Liam Robertson, and our goal for today is to figure out the why and how behind their cancellation. By the way, I could not have made this video without them, so please go check them out. Quality control concerns, budget and time limitations, financial issues, etc. are usually the main culprits behind a video game getting the axe, and with each cancelled title comes a unique story to tell. Get ready to explore the murky depths of mystery as we enter the world of cancelled fighting games. When we think of the words Marvel and fighting games, the seizure-inducing action of the Marvel vs. Capcom series explodes into our mind like a Dormammu special move, but this isn't what we're here to talk about. As far as I know, there hasn't been a cancelled Marvel vs. Capcom game, but that doesn't mean there hasn't been a cancelled Marvel fighting game. Developed by Electronic Arts in their rightful home of the flaming pits of hell from 2006 to 2007, Marvel Chaos was planned to be a fighting game that included iconic Marvel heroes and villains battling in large, semi-open world maps that allowed for player creativity and mass destruction. Created by EA Chicago, the studio behind Fight Night and Def Jam Icon, it wasn't enough to have these iconic comic book characters doing battle on a 2D or 3D plane. Instead, they could freely explore large locations filled with unique terrain, environmental hazards, and even civilians, with the intention of making the game world feel alive. Iconic figures like Captain America, Spider-Man, Thor, the Hulk, and Juggernaut, just to name a few, were said to appear as playable fighters, and we can only imagine how they would have traversed around the numerous levels. Maybe Spider-Man could swing around from building to building as Juggernaut crashed into it to get his hands on him. The ideas here are limitless. Despite the project being cancelled early in development, a main menu and character select screen had some work done, and I have to say, these look awesome. I mean, they're obviously unfinished, but framing it so that it looks like the player is entering the world of a living and breathing comic book makes too much sense, and it reminds me of the ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 character select. The main menu also reveals that a quick battle, extra modes, and online play were planned for this title, and I speculate there would have also been a story mode that explains why everyone is at odds with one another. According to former EA Chicago general manager and Kinect avatar enthusiast Kudo Tsunoda, we looked at past comic book games to find out what was missing and what was needed to successfully translate the intensity, excitement, and fiction from comics into fighting games. We're challenging ourselves to make a game that delivers on the superhero promises of past top-tier fighting games. From this, we can deduce that the development studio's goal was one of authenticity, as their primary objective was to develop a video game that shared many aesthetic similarities with Marvel's comic books. From what we've seen so far, I'm of the opinion that they pretty much succeeded in what they were able to create. From the crude lighting, animations, camera, and frame rate, I assume that Marvel Chaos would have probably had a few months of early development before optimizations began. The character roster and their 3D models don't seem to be finalized yet, and with how early this build is, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the characters would have wound up cut from the final product. The menus also display factoids and the superpowers of the fighters, although I believe these are here for placeholder purposes, and maybe a complete move list or something like that would appear here in the final game. But enough about the characters, because with any open world game, the city is the true protagonist. Very early recordings of environmental destruction tests are on YouTube, but their quality is pretty bad, so we're just gonna have to make do. Many characters are seen performing attacks that lead to real-time destruction, and this was slated to be a major component of the battle mechanics. This is certainly a very ambitious concept, but I can't help but wonder how this would impact the game's sense of direction and performance. Having to render 2 superheroes battling in a dense environment with lifelike NPCs, who would also need their own behaviors and AI mind you, at a solid frame rate sounds like a bit too much for these poor guys to handle, and it also leads me to arguably the greatest elephant in the room. Because Marvel Chaos doesn't display the positions of both characters at all times, what would happen if your character went off screen? Or what would happen if the characters went to opposite sides of the map? The camera always seems to focus on player 1, so maybe it was intended for the players to experience the game via a LAN setup with multiple monitors? At this point, it's clear that the developers would have had a lot of problems like this to solve, and with the points I mentioned before, they definitely had their work cut out for them. Marvel Chaos was also planned to have multiple attack and interaction buttons, and this combined with its level design leads me to believe that it would have been more of an arena fighter. Fans of all things Marvel would have been disappointed in late 2007, as this is when GameSpot reported that EA decided to close down their Chicago studio, cancelling all of their works in the process. This article states that the studio was also working on another licensed fighting game, but I unfortunately wasn't able to find information about this title. The reason for EA Chicago's dismantling was because it went against EA's philosophy of taking artistic risks, supposedly, while also delivering profit margins. In other words, the studio's games were selling very well despite them hiring over 100 new employees to work on new titles, so they were unfortunately put down old Yellow style. It's a shame that Marvel Chaos was never finished, as I think its concept is amazing, and who knows, maybe something similar can happen on future console generations with hardware that would be able to render all the required assets at the same time. But until then, we can only imagine what could have been. Keeping with the superhero theme, did you know that famed DC Comics character Lobo was set to star in his own 90s fighting game? Admittedly, I'm not too familiar with the character of Lobo and his source material outside of Injustice 1, so this was a very interesting game concept that I had never heard of before. Originally, the plan to get Lobo onto the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo was for Ocean of America and High Performance Games to develop their own respective versions of the title in tandem, with them both set to release in 1996. Heavily inspired by how Rare used Silicon Graphics computers for 1994's Killer Instinct, Lobo was set to render its characters and stages as highly detailed digitized sprites. And as you can tell from the gameplay footage, I'm using the term highly detailed with a touch of sarcasm. On a hilarious note, I did some looking and I managed to track down a preview of Lobo in issue 83 of GamePro magazine, where they had this to say. As if we needed a reason to bury the Genesis, along comes Lobo, one of the most god-awful fighting games since Time Killers. Unless you're a fan who has to own every single piece of Lobo merchandise available, steer clear of this game. You choose from 6 poorly illustrated warriors that fight with jerky, unpredictable special moves. Since Lobo is based on some of the best comic book art of all time, this is a major disappointment. The sound isn't bad, but it gets lost in the dismal gameplay. The battles resound with smacks and groans aplenty, but no trademark Lobo wisecracks. This badly executed game doesn't deserve a place on the shelf with other comic book games. Rent it, play it, return it. This one's a low blow. I've read some harsh game review quotes in my previous videos, but this one is probably the most mean-spirited. And with how you had to Tiger Knee a half-circle input to perform a projectile, I can't blame Scary Larry for saying that. Ooh, watch out boys and girls, Scary Larry is coming to shit on your video game. Anyway, there isn't much information about the specifics of Lobo's development cycle on various websites, but a highly detailed page written about the game on SNEScentral.com reveals a bunch of information, including a quote from Ocean Interactive artist John Lomax. For Lobo, it was very similar to Green Lantern, another cancelled project. I worked on it for about a month before moving projects. It was originally going to be a Street Fighter style beat 'em up, and I did work on background art for it, but the powers that be decided it would be better to give it to Ocean America to work on, so I don't know if it ever came out, even in Japan. In a video titled Diaries of a Game Coder, Episode 4, Lobo SNES programmer Alexander Erath states that Game Studio Park Place Productions were the original developers, but after they blew through their budget without completing the work, Ocean had to step in and try to finish it themselves. All of this suggests that even before the negative press, Lobo's development was one of turmoil, and I'm not sure if anyone involved had a clear vision for the project. I'm far from being a comic book expert, but my research tells me that Lobo himself was a fairly popular DC character throughout the 90s. Designed by former comic writers and artists Roger Slifer and Keith Giffen, Lobo was an indictment of the Punisher, Wolverine, badass hero prototype, and somehow he caught on as the high-violence poster boy. With a pre-existing fanbase and plenty of characters to pull from, a fighting game based on the Lobo IP starts to make a lot of sense, but as Unseen64 points out, there were plenty of factors working against such a game. For starters, the public had jumped on the 3D graphics bandwagon, and even though the sprites were technically 3D models, they didn't look that great when rendered on home consoles. And as these consoles were on the way out, more people were looking towards the Nintendo 64, PlayStation, and Sega Saturn for brand new experiences. Adding horrible press and previews into this deadly concoction can only spell disaster, and that's exactly what led to Lobo's cancellation. I even found a comment stating that the game's development began all the way back in 1992 for the Amiga 1200, but I'm unable to find further information. Now's about the time we'd move on to the next game, but Lobo has earned its fair share of obsessors over the years due to its very mysterious nature. Thanks to many fans, both versions of this game have leaked online, and the SNES version source code is also publicly available. For those wanting to try this game out, there's a happy ending to this story, and I'm sure we'll see it at EVO one year. Okay, jokes aside, it's fantastic how Lobo has been preserved, as even though it's not very good, it'd suck even harder if it were to become lost media. With Lobo's film debut set for 2026's Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, perhaps his fanbase will grow, leading to him showing up in a future fighting game. As my second favorite open world crime series, you'll always be my number one GTA. Saints Row is home to countless wacky characters, locations, and set pieces, and with series mainstay Johnny Gat appearing in Dive Kick, a Saints Row fighting game sounds like a perfect idea on paper. Dubbed The Cooler, a brand new entry into the series created by Heavy Iron Studios that focused on close quarters combat began development in March 2010, and was set to release for the Xbox 360 and PS3. There's also an estimated 40 or so people who worked on the game, and a team like this does seem adequate for the scope of the project, which we'll cover in a bit. According to an unnamed artist who worked on the game, it was a brawler game. Go to a bar, pick a fight, smash a bottle over someone's head. And this indicates that the game's general idea had been finalized by the developers. Admittedly, this idea doesn't sound too bad, but there's one major hiccup I really have to mention. Due to the rise of motion control technology in the video game industry at the time, the cooler was set to utilize the Kinect on 360 and PlayStation Move on PS3, meaning that the entire game was set to use motion controls. To be fair here, there are other games around this time that also use the same technology, but none of them are amazing, so I can only wonder how unresponsive it would have been to try and throw out a punch in the cooler. A developer on the game compared it to the fight Lights Out on PS3, but I'm not sure if that's a game you should be taking inspiration from. But hey, at least that game gave us some incredible cutscenes with Danny Trejo.
Do it right!
This is real. Unlike the mainline Saints Row entries, the cooler was not an open world game, with the project's focus primarily being on hand-to-hand combat between realistic characters, although there was planned extra content to keep players invested. Continuing from the previous quote, with lots of fighting matches in about 8 of the Saints Row locales, plus a few new locations we crafted, and a bar ecosystem where the player could order drinks, get lap dances, gamble, etc. This all sounds very ambitious, as it would have essentially been a motion-controlled version of the Conker's Bad Fur Day main menu, with the player walking around and interacting with NPCs. Now, with my experience of going to bars back in the 80s, I can tell you that drinks and gambling certainly aren't free, so one can only assume that clearing fights would earn you money which you could then use to invest into these vices. As far as motion-controlled lap dances go, that just sounds awful, I can't even make a joke about it. Keeping with its mature subject matter, the title was said to have a very gritty tone and visual aesthetic, with fights breaking out in warehouses, pub bathrooms, and even a slaughterhouse. I'm not sure if pre-existing characters from the Saints were set to appear here, but the main character does seem to be created specifically for this game. According to other former developers, the player could customize his appearance and clothing, so it's safe to assume that the created character feature would have returned. By the way, I forgot to mention this before due to Danny Trejo scaring the pants off of me, but the phrase "the cooler" comes from the protagonist. An animator on the game revealed that the protagonist was a bouncer who worked his way up the food chain and that his job was to cool off situations. I'm sure this may sound a bit corny to some of you, but I personally love the name. It sounds like some early 2000s sci-fi anime or a King of Fighters character or something. So, with a solid idea, good-looking concept art, a unique battle system, and bonus content all given the green light, why did the cooler never see the light of day? Why was it cancelled? It's reported that the title was knocked out by THQ due to quality concerns, with it being 60% complete at the time of its cancellation. The developers had spent the past 6 months going full steam ahead, targeting a mid-2011 launch period, meaning that the entire game would have had to be completed in under 2 years. Despite the fact that its developers had committed hard work and lots of time, the cooler was never publicly announced, and members of the press weren't given previews before its untimely death. Its legacy lives on though, as the Saints Row series continued strong into the 2010s, wowing players with its commitment to over-the-top scenarios, until the reboot straight up wiped its studio off the face of the earth. However, there's an unexpected turn of events, as the 2011 game UFC Personal Trainer The Ultimate Fitness System incorporates motion-controlled fighting systems, and not only that, it was also developed by Heavy Iron. Yeah, it's quite obvious that their work on the cooler had made its way over to this UFC title, and it actually got decent reviews surprisingly. Because of its reliance on motion controls, there's absolutely no hope of this game, or any Saints Row game for that matter, coming back to life anytime soon, and that really sucks. Saints Row is an amazing series, and if you haven't already, you gotta play Saints Row 2, man, that game rocks. Given how the previous games we've covered have all been developed in the West, I thought it would be a nice palate cleanser if we switched over to the home of insane game shows and pirate radio stations. That's right, Nippon. With many crossover titles under their belt, Capcom definitely knows how to make a killer tag fighter, so when it was announced at the 2003 Jumble arcade show that they would be collaborating with Sammy, people's interest started to perk up. For those uninitiated, Sammy is a division of Sega that published many titles throughout the early 2000s, most notably Guilty Gear and the Rumblefish. This implies that Ryu and Ken could have crossed paths with Sol and Kai in an official 2D fighting game, which sounds like madness. The timing of this announcement leads me to believe that the game, titled Sammy vs Capcom, would have run on either the Naomi or Atomus Wave arcade boards, as these were used for the aforementioned titles. According to an article from IGN published on September 12, 2003, other than the announcement that the game would be an action fighting game, nothing solid on the title was revealed. Capcom's Norotaka Funamizu did offer his personal view on what he'd like to see become of the game, stating, "Personally, I like to see the Capcom characters brought to life using the Guilty Gear visual concept. Personally, I'm interested in seeing how the Vampire Hunter characters would look." This seems to suggest that whatever product results of this plan will end up going the high-res Sammy route instead of the low-res arcade Capcom look. Whatever the case, Sammy vs Capcom will arrive in arcades on the Sammy-produced Atomus Wave arcade board. This all sounds very promising, but literally nothing happened after the Jammer show. The next mention of Sammy vs Capcom was on the Capcom forums in 2009, where a curious fan inquired about the project's status. Former Capcom employee Seth Killian then replied by stating, "This was a project with some interest at one point, but it has been dormant for a long time. Things are different today than when the idea was originally conceived, both in terms of the changed market for fighting games as well as the corporate changes at Sammy/Arc Systems/Axis, and I haven't heard anything about it since I've been at Capcom." To recap, the incredibly short timeline of this game begins with its initial announcement and then a long period of nothing before being mentioned by Seth Killian. Noritaka Funamuse's comment of seeing these Street Fighter characters in Guilty Gear's visual style implies that series creator Daisuke Ishiwatari would also have been involved, so what the heck happened? How did this game suddenly disappear? With how there's very little information online, solving this mystery sounds tough, but I did my best to chase up any loose ends. A comment I found on Resetera claims that the widely circulated rumor in Japan is that the game was killed due to drama concerning a particular subcontractor they both used. Capcom published the game by that subcontractor they used code from a game that same subcontractor had made for Sega, and that soured their relationship. I have absolutely no idea if this is true or not, and given the fact that Sammy vs. Capcom was announced over 20 years ago, it's borderline impossible to verify this claim, and because it's a Japanese rumor, even if there was a webpage or something about it written in Japanese, I would have no way of understanding it, because I can't read the language. The Atomiswave page on the Sega Retro website lists the game as being last seen in 2005, but I believe that this is an error due to there being no trailers, screenshots, interviews, location test reports, etc. of the game from that period. Using Google's time-specific search criteria, I was able to uncover an old message board from 2005 that mentioned Sammy vs. Capcom, but the users here are also concerned about the game's whereabouts. The final lead I found was back on Resetera, with user Hayama Akito mentioning that in 2004, Capcom artist Akimen claimed that Capcom Japan had sold the rights of the Street Fighter IP to Capcom USA, but their link unfortunately leads to nowhere. If you punch it into the Wayback Machine, there are no results, but I didn't let that faze me. After doing even more digging, I found an article that verifies that this rights transfer is true, and there's even a unique archive of Akimen's original claim here, so yeah, we found it. This claim comes from a blog post he made in November of 2004, and despite it having a really weird structure when translated into English, the message is clear. In addition to this rights transfer, Sega and Sammy were set to merge in 2003, with Sammy founder Hajime Satomi becoming its head leader. According to a GameSpot article from 2004 that quotes Satomi himself, Sega's finances had been in the red for the past 10 years, so the merger was agreed to out of financial necessity. The only problem was that the merger itself just ended up falling apart, and even though Sammy ended up buying 22.4% of Sega, they fired multiple pre-existing executives and made Satomi the new chairman. In 2004, a new merger was announced, and this one ended up being successful. With Capcom's complicated rights issues, a failed merger between Sega and Sammy, and the declining popularity of 2D sprite-based fighting games in general, it's no wonder that the game was shelved, and despite its promising nature, Sammy vs. Capcom most likely would have ended up as a hodgepodge of pre-existing assets, much like Capcom Fighting Evolution was. There are so many parties involved when attempting an IP collaboration, and this is unfortunately the one that got away. You know, after spending the past few days writing and doing research about cancelled fighting games, it makes me appreciate released ones even more. I don't know how studios create video games in general without going insane due to how complicated the process can be, and I find it very unfortunate that the 4 games we covered went the way of the dodo. I'd be lying if I said they all looked or even sounded great, but at the very least, their memories and core concepts have been preserved by die-hard fans online, ensuring that they will never be lost. Before we wrap up, I'd like to once again thank the hard work of Unseen64, Liam Robertson, and everyone else I cited throughout this video. They're the true heroes of this story as they've made it their goal to inform fighting game fans of what could have been, and as I'm someone who thinks game preservation is very important, their contributions to this topic are invaluable. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, thanks a lot for watching. I really appreciate your time and I hope you had fun. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.